Absolute Extrema. We have been learning about a ton of different function characteristics. We've learned about increasing and decreasing intervals and relative extrema. Today, we will be learning about absolute extrema. You might remember that relative extrema is when a function reaches a relative minimum or a relative maximum. That means we look for the highest or the lowest point within an interval. We can find the relative extrema using the first or second derivative tests. Typically in algebra 2, we will just look at a graph to see where there are small bumps that change the direction of the graph. The absolute extrema, in contrast, are the absolute maximum and absolute minimum values that a function can take. We can also think of these as global extrema. Absolute extrema can happen at an endpoint, while relative extrema cannot happen at an endpoint. As I mentioned before, there are a couple of complex mathematical ways that we can find extrema. Since we are using Algebra 2 techniques, we will be using the graphing way to find the absolute extrema. That means that we will look at the graph and visually identify the absolute extrema. You can also think of this as qualitatively finding the absolute extrema. So let's look at a couple of examples. In this first example, I have graphed the function y equals x squared minus 1 for you. We will look at this graph over the interval of x from -2 to 3. We are only looking at this function within the interval so we can find a numerical value for the absolute extrema. Remember that without the interval, the range of y equals x squared minus 1 would go on until positive infinity. I've also labeled the absolute max and absolute min for you. As you can see, I looked at the graph and I labeled the highest possible value and the lowest possible value. Here is another graph for you. I have graphed the function y equals x cubed for you over the interval of x from -1 to +1. Looking at the graph, what do you think the absolute extrema are? Pause and try this one on your own. Here's the answer. The absolute max is at 1, 1, and the absolute min is at -1, -1. These are the highest and lowest points, respectively. So that is how you find the absolute extrema graphically. Thank you so much for coming.